Metro's Regional System Facilities Plan research and engagement process also revealed similar themes. This past June, Metro Council directed staff to assess an approach for sustainable funding for private and nonprofit organizations to support reuse. And this direction also included supporting one-time funding for reuse and repair organizations, which Metro did back in September. Next slide, please. Our recommendation today is to create a 3-year reuse impact fund pilot focused on nonprofit organizations to support maintenance and expansion of services provided by the reuse, repair, and share sector. Nonprofit organizations are often uncompensated for the role they play in reducing waste, as well as the positive impacts they create for the community, such as providing free or low-cost items to the region's most vulnerable residents. The intention of the Reuse Impact Fund is to provide multi-year funding, which we are defining as ongoing, predictable funds that can be used 3 ways. The first way is to support existing programs, such as funding a current warehouse space. The second is to help existing organizations achieve financial sustainability through strategic hiring or investments, such as hiring a full-time volunteer coordinator. The third is to facilitate the expansion of existing organizations to advance the goals of the 2030 Regional Waste Plan, such as buying a truck to pick up more items from donors. Next slide, please. This proposal reflects what we heard from organizations about what is necessary to sustain their important work. The pilot will focus on materials that pose significant negative environmental impacts, which could be mitigated through practices such as reuse, repair, or remanufacturing. These materials include textiles, building materials, appliances, electronics, and large items like furniture. And bicycles are also included in the pilot. Next slide, please. In exchange for funding, organizations will collaborate closely with Metro to develop a 3-year work plan that incorporates goals and measurements, data, and financial reporting. Each pilot organization must also allocate a portion of the funding for data tracking in collaboration with Metro. Our proposal includes a critical analytic investment, which will provide Metro staff with the opportunity to utilize the pilot to enhance tracking systems to evaluate reuse, repair, and share performance against regional waste plan indicators, to better target high-impact material waste diversion opportunities, and explore the feasibility connected to waste diversion. And insights from the pilot program will shape future funding rounds, which may include funding private organizations. Next slide, please. The Reuse Impact Fund is aligned with Metro's 2030 Regional Waste Plan. Reuse and repair are identified as an implementation approach for goals and actions within 2 desired outcomes of the plan: shared prosperity and product end-of-life management. The pilot is guided by 5 goals, which are also aligned with 2 of Council's strategic targets. The first goal is to help financially sustain reuse, repair, and share programs and activities. The second is to achieve measurable environmental benefits. The third is to advance equity within organizations and through programs and services. The fourth is to enhance economic and environmental measurement tools and processes. And the fifth is to inform future planning of Metro's investments in the reuse, repair, and share systems. Next slide, please. In September, we connected with representatives from reuse organizations to preview the Reuse Impact Fund. We learned that the organizations prefer a quarterly disbursement schedule and that there is appreciation for the flexible approach the fund takes to eligible expenses. It was also suggested that Metro explore a funding framework linked to waste diversion, such as funding based on the amount of tonnage allocated or diverted. In response to this suggestion, Metro staff added a pilot objective to explore the feasibility of a funding framework linked to waste diversion. Exploration is necessary due to the uncertainty in organizations' ability to report diverted tonnage, which the pilot aims to address by establishing tracking systems. Additionally, relying solely on tonnage is challenging due to varying weights and embodied carbon of different materials. Additionally, 2 of the 5 pilot objectives will address what we heard from local governments, which is the desire to better identify regional reuse needs and opportunities. Next slide, please. We are proposing a multi-year funding approach to the Reuse Impact Fund for council consideration. Each phase assumes annual increases to match inflation over the 3-year pilot period. The costs for the 2 phases are outlined here. Both phases include the addition of 1.5 FTE, which includes FTE for a program manager and analytics support, as well as an annual budget of $50,000 for contractor support and necessary data collection supplies such as scales. The total annual cost for phase 1 is $1.3 million for fiscal year 26. The total anticipated impact to the fiscal year 26 regional systems fee is an increase of 82 cents. While phase 2 will cost approximately $2.3 million, with a total anticipated impact to the regional system fee of $1.46. We anticipate phase 2 will begin in year 3 of phase 1. With that, thank you so much, counselors, for the opportunity to present this morning. I'm going to now turn the presentation back to Marta.
Thank you, Abby. If we go to the next slide, we are happy to answer any questions that you may have on the proposal that we just shared. And we also have 2 questions for your consideration today. Has the proposed impact fund addressed the June 2024 Metro Council budget amendment? And is the reuse impact fund aligned with council priorities? I will turn it back to President Peterson.
Thank you. Good job. Council, any questions? Conversation. Councilor Nolan.
Thanks, Madam Chair. A little bit of a devil's advocate here. Shocking role for me to play. The program is designed to remove items and tonnage from the waste stream. So help me understand why it's costing the system more funds, since whatever's diverted doesn't have to go to Arlington or to some other end destination. Shouldn't it offset?
It should offset. That's a great question. And I feel like it's always the eternal conundrum that we are in the field of waste reduction. We're essentially working to put ourselves out of business. I think at the highest level, addressing materials management has a cost, whether you're doing it at the end of life and transferring it to disposal to landfill, or whether you're removing it from the waste stream and moving it into a higher end use. Our goal is to remove amount of tons that go to the landfill. Right now, we don't have data on waste recovery. That's not currently tracked in our waste recovery rate in the data that we get from the state. As we look forward and as a part of this pilot, we are looking to gather some of that essential data to better understand the level of diversion that is achievable and where we can have the most impact. So theoretically, it should reduce the amount of waste that goes to the landfill, but it will still require a cost to manage that, because there's still transfer and collection and management involved in it.
Follow up. And I understand that running this particular program requires staff and resources. So I'll phrase the question as, when do we get to the point where that cost is offset by the reduction in cost on the landfill side? Because any ton we're sending to be reclaimed doesn't have to drive all the way out to Arlington or another final resting spot. So maybe in the pilot, it makes sense that we're looking for a solution. Does our pilot include moving to a place where the cost is recovered from the tonnage that's not sent to landfills?
Okay.
Or should we be educating the public to expect that the removal and safe disposition of reusable items from the waste stream is going to increase costs over the long term? That's a harder sell, frankly, to the public.
Mhm. Those are great questions, and I think the pilot will give us an opportunity to explore that more in depth. What are those costs and what are those savings as we think about the overall management of the system and these materials?
Great.
Thank
I
you.
look forward to that.
Thank you. Counselor Rosenthal, Lewis, Wong, and Gonzalez.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Sorry, I could have just.
Thank you. I had a couple questions. One is very specific. In one of your paragraphs, you say that the white goods, basically appliances, amount to 0.62, but it wasn't clear whether that was 62% or 0.62%. In other words, there was something missing. So I'm curious about that. Because if they're only 0.62%, it's so like white goods is like, it's not really a very big deal. I'm curious about that. And then the second question is, since we already have given one-time funding this last year, is that sort of a preliminary pilot? That's a pro-pilot sort of study? And how is that going to inform? And then the last question is more philosophical. Isn't it true that some of the benefits we hope to gain from this are really out-of-system benefits? In other words, we reuse materials, people will use those, and there's hardly any way we can ever track those benefits, those people will buy materials as opposed to buying new materials, and they will benefit individually, but we will never see those benefits to our system particularly. So there's some costs, it seems to me, cannot be accounted for even in this pilot study because we don't know the end user.
Absolutely. The appliance, it is less than 1%.
Is what?
The appliance in the report, it is less than 1%.
Less than 1%.
Yes. I'm going to follow all those really great questions. Can you read, what was the second one?
The second one was we distributed emergency funding out the door this September as a part of the council budget amendment. Was that considered a pilot, and do we have any learnings from that?
Yes, the proposal, the reuse impact fund proposal really leaned on learnings from that one-time funding. I would say that due to the expedited nature of those funds being distributed, we weren't able to set up the tracking systems that this pilot will be setting up. So maybe it was a pre-pilot pilot. And your third point, yes, absolutely. I think that looking at this pilot, we're going to learn things that we're going to need to investigate further. So to speak to your last point about there are costs that we may never be able to.
I mean, the benefit
for.
that strikes me is more than just fewer trips to Arlington.
Yes.
There may be other benefits, societal benefits to people and communities, et cetera, that we would be very hard to measure in any kind of real sense.
Right.
We'll probably find out.
From a quantitative perspective, I think there's qualitative approaches that we can incorporate as we look at our reuse indicator that we're currently working on building out for council. It's in development right now. And I think that will give us more information on diversion directly from businesses and nonprofit organizations. To your point, we don't have all the information.
Right.
And that's something that we're really seeking because there is such a great benefit in terms of waste reduction of keeping valuable materials out of the landfill. So we hope to have more,
Okay.
both in terms of numbers and impact.
Okay, Counselor Lewis.
Sure, thank you so much. I want to thank you for carrying this work forward as one of the authors of the budget amendment note. I do think that it meets the expectations. I think that it does two things. It provides space for learning and iteration while also providing a sense of at least mid-range stability, which seems really important, particularly in this moment for the nonprofits who do this work. I do think that the inclusion of repair right alongside reuse, reuse gets the bulk of the tons, but repair has a very specific place in the constellation, particularly because of intellectual property law and computers being inserted into like literally every good. The complications of repair we're at a pivotal moment. If we don't embed it in our culture, if we don't figure out how to fund it, it's gonna be far too far past us when we run out of silicon to keep putting in things. So I am extremely supportive of that. In terms of the overview, I love how it's in 2 phases, and I like how you've attached 2 budgets. I do think at some point we'll want to check in on how the implementation of the fee is going and if the step up is right and if it's right timed. The other thing I will say is I'd like us to add a very explicit ability to score based off of salaries, wages, and benefits for the organizations. Some of the largest reuse organizations, I think, also have some difficult labor challenges. And since the rest of our work has centered workforce training, and workforce equity within WPES, I feel like we shouldn't leave that behind in this initiative. So I'd like to see that added. But otherwise, I find it both very responsive to the note as written and to our iteration, both written and oral communication. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Counselor Wong.
Thank you, Madam President. And yeah, thanks for putting this program together. I feel very supportive of our nonprofit ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just, starting with a question. I know the pre-pilot kind of grants went out in September. So it's probably like too early to have specific outcomes, but I'm wondering if you can talk about kind of the impact that those awards will have and what kind of the grantees expect to, or said they would use kind of those funds on.
The intent of, that's a great question. In terms of the emergency funding, our intent and direction was to get that out the door as quickly as possible. What we had heard from a number of nonprofit organizations was just the ability to maintain current services, and a number of organizations having to do reductions because of operational deficits. So the primary focus of that funding was going to support ongoing operations. And so I think that as we've distributed that funding, it's something that we can definitely loop back to those recipients to get more information on the impact of that funding on their operations.
So in like nonprofit parlance, they were basically general operating grants. And I think that's extremely valuable, but I think in the new pilot program, in essence, they seem like also generating operating grants, right? Like you can, like eligible uses were like insurance or rent or things like that. So I think, my thinking is, we're not a foundation and we're not like a philanthropy, but like I really do support kind of the essence of trust-based philanthropy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the intent here is to make sure, our nonprofit partners are able to succeed and thrive. And tying them to too many outcomes, I think, takes away from that goal and intent, and is also really hard to track when you're, giving out, in essence, general operating grants. Right. So it's hard to track, waste reduction into the waste system when you're like, I'll pay for your insurance, because that doesn't lead to a specific reduction. But we know overall that these organizations are doing great work and they are reducing the waste stream. So I think for me, like the pilot grant is less about specific outcomes for those dollars, but really about ensuring the survival and success of our partner orgs. So I don't know that I would want to see a ton of detail about like this input of dollars leads to this Y reduction.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's really about, are these partners kind of being supported to accomplish their overall mission And then the metric for me might be, you know, waste diverted as an organization rather from these dollars, if that makes sense. Because I think we're really investing kind of in that general ops, and also, you know, there's this level of trust here that we want to have, which I think a lot of foundations are moving towards, having more flexible dollars, because I think nonprofits know what they need to be successful. So yeah, I think just finding the right partners and then trusting them to do their work. I think, you know, definitely some accountability, but tying those numbers together doesn't necessarily make sense just because everyone's using their dollars what the highest need for.
That's great feedback.
Great, thank
Thank you.
Great. Counselor Gonzalez.
For sure, for sure. All right, similar line of comments here. And you know, first, you know, with the grants from the pre-pilot that we were able to put out, I think this money that we're able to invest in our nonprofit partners is very high impact investments, and you know, tongue in cheek, very scrappy organizations. Get it? Because scrap reuse. Okay.
No, I got it.
Dang. All right. Oh, okay. All right.
Laugh line.
I like private planning. And you know, whether some of the larger or smaller organizations, I know that they're leveraging this money 3-5x. I was able to have coffee with one of the new organizations that we funded out in the Tigard area called Wood Love Oregon, and meeting with their staff and learning about just the tremendous work that they're doing. And you know, they weren't even on my radar when we've been working through this. So that was great. And kind of coming back to the amendment that I know Councilor Lewis championed. I think the data systems and streamlining of KPIs is a huge benefit to the system. And that's one of the things that I'm most excited about to see come out of this RIF, or this the impact fund, in which we're able to track regional progress across consistent measures. Something that I know we're working to incorporate in other areas of the agency and other funds. So a common themes here. Going back to the something that Councilor Wong was mentioning around philanthropy and trust-based philanthropy and all that stuff. You know, with some of my experience and career in the nonprofit sector and writing grants and stuff like that, you know, I always look at admin rates. And so as I'm looking at the measures, and I know I mentioned this to you, Marta, as well, when we were discussing it, but one of my kind of concerns right now off the gate is that for $1 million, we're spending $300,000 on staff, on our staff, which is, you know, either, depending on how you do the math, could either be like a 23 to 30% admin rate. And so it feels heavy. Maybe I'm not looking at it the right way in terms of admin, but then we're also standing up a program, and thinking through, like, if we're asking our the community providers to, you know, the industry standard is 10%, that we're kind of doing the same practices that we're expecting our grantees to follow. So anyway, I think this is a broader conversation about our contracting practices and things like that. But that number stood out to me. I know that we've talked about it before, and I just want to kind of put that on the docket in terms of how restrictive we are when those grants do come out, that we're not asking them to do something that we might not be implementing into the modulation of the program.
I appreciate that. And I believe we did update the level of FTE to the program to reduce what that amount is.
Yes. When we met with you earlier, we were thinking it would be 2 FTE, and now we're planning for 1.5 FTE. So a program manager and analytics, half-time analytics support person.
Yeah. Okay. And I did hear that. You know, I appreciate one of the responsiveness from y'all to like trying to acknowledge that. And I think I'm also grounding myself in the fact that this is a pilot. So the kind of the startup costs for developing some of these systems, and as we begin to hopefully grant more money over time, that number for us stays consistent while the money that goes out continues to grow based off those investments. So anyway, just again, I don't know why my brain goes to the part of the numbers and the budgeting, but I think it's important. And we're talking a lot in general about our contracting and what does it mean to have a good relationship with an organization that we're funding or that our subsidiaries are funding. So yeah.
No, I appreciate that comment. When we look at our budget and fees, labor is a big factor. And one of the key learnings that we had from developing the Investment and Innovation Grant Program is just a better understanding of the level of staff time it does take to lift a brand new program up off the ground and get it started, but then also want to have enough capacity to be able to provide technical assistance and support program organizations and to have enough of that capacity in our program. And so we do feel like that is a reasonable request to have a program manager to facilitate these grant programs. The addition of the analytics FTE is also a learning. That's something that we often don't allocate resources to. And so that is an investment area we think is really important for all the reasons that you just said in terms of having better data and investing in that area, but definitely conscious of that cost factor and wanting to make sure that we're treating ourselves the same as we would recipients to the program.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to say thank you. This overall conversation past 18 months has been trending us in a direction that I think we all agreed we needed to move towards, which was really putting the time and energy into the places that the reduce, the reuse, recycle side of things, and not just the waste stream to the landfill. So I think I'm appreciative of moving into the things that have gotten the least attention, because we know the private sector can get the waste to the landfill. We really do need to help keep it out of the landfill. So I'm just going to say thank you for moving this direction. It's a lot of work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. No further questions?
On the screen.
I'm sorry.
You're good.
Y'all talked and then I just moved on to the next one.
That's all right.
Councilor Simpson, apologies.
No, you're okay. Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Director McGuire, for the presentation. And real just big uplift to Councilor Lewis on this budget note. This is something I think our community has been asking for some time in terms of like getting that support as we build out a system to truly reduce waste. I won't belabor a lot of the issues that my colleagues brought up, but I am in agreement around this. This pilot should be flexible, particularly for those nonprofits that are trying to get this work done. It's tough out there to run a nonprofit on pennies. I will say it bluntly, and I want to make sure that if we're building a system to help reduce waste, that we're showing up just like we would show up with any other industry partner in doing this work. So again, shout out to and big hats off to you, Councilor Nolan, for having the forward thinking around this and making sure that we get this done. And thank you again, Marta, for getting this pilot pushed out. And I'm ready for it. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. Councilor Rosenthal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just one quick comment. First of all, I support the program. I think it's a good idea. I hope we can come up with a selection process that's somewhat less cumbersome than the I&I process that we did several years ago, which was a bit more complicated than what we want. And I hope that we also ask them, whoever we give grant awards to estimate you might say the economic value of the recycling process. It's something that we will probably not be able to do, but something that we need to ask them to do, because I think that that's going to be important data going forward, not just what our costs are or how many tons, but I think the economic value most pushed forward out into society. So I hope that that's part of the process.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Okay, now we're done.
Thank you.
Apologies. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Council, we'll move on to our regional supportive housing services and affordable housing funding discussion, proposed future allocation approach. For our next topic, this this is a continuation of our conversation about the future funding
Yes.
for affordable housing and regional supportive housing services. In October, after months of engagement, with stakeholders, community members, and our partners in government,
People care about the RIF. That's
after months of engagement with stakeholders, community members, and our partners in government and the nonprofit and private sectors, this council directed staff to return to us with a package of proposals. We asked staff for policy recommendations that affirm this council's priorities for establishing an integrated and expanded regional housing services and affordable housing program. Today, I'm looking forward to sharing a proposed approach for allocating revenues in a way that delivers predictable and sufficient funding to maintain the work of this region's incredible and tireless service providers, and that provides a new path for much needed investments in deeply affordable and permanent supportive housing. We know that these investments result in the best outcomes for people experiencing or on the brink of homelessness when they are paired together. Today, we'll walk through and discuss your desired outcomes and considerations for the overall approach, followed by each of the proposed funding programs. We'll have live note-taking during our discussion, similar to October 3rd work session, which shaped the resolution council adopted on October 17th. Then we will hear from Chief Financial Officer Brian Kennedy on a pair of scenarios that would put this approach into action and consider what they tell us about potential outcomes for services and housing investments across the region. In considering this proposal, I want to hear your thoughts on the efficiency of this program in balancing our housing and supportive housing needs, as well as what you'd prioritize in each funding program. Thinking forward to our work session next Thursday, I hope you'll share your initial thoughts on how we can ensure accountability within the program and how new oversight structures could support implementation success. All right, we'll move on to the presentation. All right, already gone through that. So is that slide 2? Okay, that helps. We need to be clear about 4 things as we go through this conversation. Both housing and services are both needed to address homelessness. We need every tool and every partner we can get on this. We can't allow the region to hit a cliff for either services or housing. We are going to need to keep investing for a long time to come. This is our opportunity to make sure we have stability in the system. And we are making progress, but we know that it's not perfect. Partners, community members, and voters have told us that more of the same will not do. We have to make changes, and no funding source can do it all. But we have an opportunity to ensure that this one is here for a long time. We have to make sure that our priorities are clear and we are ready to put them into action, and then we can learn and adapt as we go. So today, we're going to be specifically talking about the funding mechanism and allocation model as we go forward for reform within the system. But first, I want to ground us in how we got here and next steps. Last winter and spring, our COO led a process to develop a recommendation of reforms for the program for council consideration. The COO recommendation was informed by a stakeholder table, community and partner engagement, and public opinion research. In July, council began our own process to engage and deliberate on the potential reforms. This included conversations with county chairs, mayors, advocate groups, community, and providers. Also included a series of work council sessions to talk about elements of reform package. Those work sessions culminated in October 17th resolution directing staff to develop a package of policy proposals for council discussion and decision. As a reminder, that resolution said that the package should aim to establish an integrated and expanded regional supportive housing services and affordable housing program. Staff have been working on that proposal, and organizations have continued to advocate for their needs in the reform package. For additional information, we also want to share some feedback we received. Portland Metro Chamber and Here Together sent a letter on November 13th to council calling for specific reforms, including funding changes like the tax rate reduction and a sunset extension. continued priority of those with highest need for services and housing, expanding allowable uses to include affordable housing and pre-development strategies, making funding to service providers more predictable through budgeting and extending the sunset, a new governance body and independent oversight to improve performance and strengthen accountability measures. And much of this is aligned with the direction we provided in the resolution in October to staff. Additionally, we began to hold an engagement table with county elected leaders and mayors. I appreciate both Councilor Simpson and Councilor Lewis's coming to that table to participate. We got feedback on different parts of this and learned about the impacts of the allocation and governance model options before we discuss them here. And I hope to use that to help inform our discussion and decisions. Lastly, we'll have a few work sessions to talk about elements of a reform package before we consider taking action in December or January. Next slide. So the funding model that we've been talking about, and we don't have exact buckets in the visuals, Councilor Gonzalez, but we do have circles. But just think of them as buckets. As I mentioned earlier, we passed a resolution on October 17th with direction to staff. One part of that resolution was direction to propose a funding model, specifically directing staff to develop conservative funding allocation approach to create more predictability for implementing partners and included a tax rate decrease, and to provide stable resources for affordable housing and city investments. And while we know with this revenue, we're not going to solve everything, the council direction aimed to make changes to do this work more efficiently and effectively, and it is only one piece of the puzzle. So we're here today to talk about basically this slide and the amount of funding behind it. We're seeking council's feedback on this allocation method, the policy direction outcomes for each program area. So we're going to review this model, which supports building more predictable funding for services and housing. And we'll get into specific dollar amounts with our CFO after this. But first, I want to have a general understanding and agreement on the concept and goals of the model. We are proposing this waterfall or bucket system, similar to what you have seen with the VFIGA. For those who don't know who that is, what that is, that's the Visitors Fund Intergovernmental Agreement. Each bucket has a priority order in which it is filled, and the further down the line, the more volatile that funding could be. Briefly, for first priority is collection costs and admin to ensure ongoing support for programs. The next is the services bucket for the 3 counties. In the current model, it would be the largest bucket and the top priority for funding. After that, you can see funding would flow to affordable housing, followed by cities program. And lastly, any remaining funds would go to a flexible fund for H2PAC allocation, or HPAC, however we decide to call it. I'd like to talk about each of these buckets, what they are solving for, and some of the principles behind them. And then we can discuss the principles and priorities together. We will run that conversation similarly again as we did on October 3rd with live note-taking and a worksheet. The regional administrative tax collection is the next slide.
While we're doing that, you did have buckets. It's just an aerial view of the buckets.
Yeah, it's top view.
It's
Not the only one who was thinking that.
it's not a bucket.
Love it.
Those are not buckets. I'm so literal that I wanted an actual bucket, but this is good. This is great. It gets the point across.
It's a bird's eye view of a bucket.
Yeah, it's a bird. Oh, I see. I see. You're right. You're right. I just won't be able to see the overflow. Yeah. Bird's eye view. Oh, okay. So the first thing we need to talk about is this regional admin and tax collection. This provides for the ongoing stable funding for the collection costs and Metro admin as being the first bucket, and supports accountability, transparency, and strategic integration of services and housing by funding staffing for new governance and oversight model. It is set as the first priority to ensure continued collection of revenue and oversight of the program. So the first question for us all to just discuss is, are there any principles or goals you want to see reflected in this bucket that have not been mentioned? And is this the right priority for this bucket? Thoughts? Counselor Lewis.
Sure, thank you. I think it's really important that we maintain our desire to be good communicators about collecting the tax. With our partnership / contract with City of Portland, I know we've had some bumps and we need to have continuous improvement there. Otherwise, I am quite willing to have a conversation about if Department of Revenue is a better vendor for this service. But communication is really key here.
Mhm.
Yes, Counselor Wong.
Thank you, Madam President. Just wondering if this is the bucket that includes some of the like system-wide elements that we had, including
The regional program.
Yeah, I'm thinking about kind of like the data administration and also like partner and capacity building. And is that from this pot or
No,
a later pot?
it
or
would
later
have to come
bucket?
from the other programs.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is just really
Yeah,
just on the tax
like the
collection.
regional program could or could not exist in some way, but that really goes to HPAC.
Okay. Including
Into
the,
this flexible fund for other things.
including the data administration, because that's.
No, the data administration is still ours.
But in this bucket.
Yes, yeah,
Okay. Thanks.
if I'm correct. Yes, okay. Any other questions? Counselor Simpson and then Gonzalez.
Yes, thank you, Madam President. Just quickly want to just have a quick understanding. Does that mean that we as Metro would stay at our 5% administrative cap, keeping up with inflation?
Yeah, I'm gonna ask Brian to come on up, help answer some of these more technical questions. Thank you. Welcome.
Thought I could hide in the back a little bit longer.
No,
You can't do that. Metro's top bean counter. Let's go.
Counselor Simpson, I couldn't quite hear the question.
Yeah. So would we stay as Metro at a 5% administrative cap, and just adjusting with inflation over time?
Yes and no. So in the scenarios you'll see, well, if you recall, the original measure, Metro's administrative costs were limited at 5% of revenue collection. As part of the scenarios that we developed, we basically took Metro's administrative costs as they are today and then capped them and grew them with inflation rather than fluctuating with the overall revenue collections over the life of the measure. That would result in a lower amount of Metro administrative costs than if they remained tied to that 5% of total revenues.
Right. And that makes sense because, over time, it should reduce because we are actually tackling the problem. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
awesome, thank you. Counselor Gonzalez.
Yeah, I really appreciate Councilor Lewis's comment on Department of Revenue versus in our contracting relationship there. I know many of us, we receive around the tax season, we receive dozens, if not hundreds of emails about communication and clarification and penalties and things like that. So just I'm kind of eager as the program matures for us to continue like a commitment to continuous improvement for that. And also, I think it's important to acknowledge that outside of this process that we're leading, we did do a significant improvement with the business tax side, which is we changed something that I remember there that was important to Oregon-based businesses. I think, oh man, it's escaping me the comment I wanted to make here. I think with regards to our admin cap, I would like for us to, if possible, find a time to really discuss at a higher level what it means for like the regional system, the metro, our staff in really implementing and leading a program at a high level. 5% of the money that we're collecting feels quite high, and I think that's feedback that we've received from a lot of partners. So I would just like to learn more about that and see how we can communicate to our regional partners and to the system in general that as we aim to make our system more effective, that we are part of that as well. So anyway, I guess that's the comment I wanted to make.
So to that, that concept of like, how big is our program and how is it growing? Would the affordable housing staff that we have now, they would come out of this pot of money as well? Is that how we envisioned it?
That's been the staff's thinking on this. I think one of the things we really wanted to avoid is with the 2018 Affordable Housing Bond, there was a compromise made around Metro's administrative costs, which are the net result is now the Metro General Fund is going to be spending about $1 million a year backfilling those administrative costs because the program doesn't generate the requirements in the program don't generate enough revenue to cover the true cost of running that program. And Metro's actual discretionary general fund is very small, about $23 million a year. So we don't have other resources to fund this work.
Is that 1 million for the housing bond, the gap per year?
Per year.
And is that throughout the 20-year life of the bond, or is that only right now where we're working towards the spend down?
Now, roughly current fiscal year through spend down.
Okay. Thanks.
I know that this is a question that you have, Counselor, and I'm wondering if you and another one or two counselors would be interested in working with our COO, Marisa, and Patricia on what does the life of the program hold in terms of size and scope, if this were to be extended, and maybe come back to us with some recommendations.
I would really appreciate that because I do think, we've experienced on the one hand issues with the affordable housing bond not having enough, having a little bit of excess in the SHS. And if we're proposing to do both those functions in this program, I really want to make sure that that we have the resources that we need to provide the transparency and the accountability and oversight for the program.
Okay.
So
that sounds wonderful.
if there are any volunteers now, that's great. Otherwise, let me know later. Counselor Wong, Counselor Gonzalez, one more. Counselor Lewis. All right. Thank you. We'll work to get that meeting set up. Thank you. All right. Any other questions on the prior? Counselor Rosenthal.
Yeah, just a question. So far, if I'm not correct, my estimate would be that we have 12 or $13 million that we can take from the SHS funding, which is used for administration. I mean, that's just the rough numbers that we have right now, 5%, right? So would we be adding new? No, that's not correct.
Closer to 17 million. 5% of revenues is around 17 million.
Okay, 17 million. Would we be adding any new allocations? In other words, new ways of using that money that are not in the current process that we're using those monies for?
Councilor Rosenthal, I think.
And the reason I ask is because when you have a bucket and it says administration costs, that can mean a lot of different things. It can mean just the actual administration of the money and coordinating communication, but it can also include some other larger concept things, long-term planning and things like that.
I will try not to get out over my skis here. I don't think the Metro Code necessarily significantly limits our spending of the Metro administrative cost portion. However, our IGA with the counties does. We have an agreement over what we can spend that money on, and I think that is probably the bigger restriction at this point.
Thank you. Metro Council President Peterson, catching your glance from the side, I will look up in the code provisions as well. Generally speaking, we have, Mr. Kennedy is correct that we are dealing in this program with sort of two levels where we have intergovernmental agreements with the city of Portland and with our county providers, as well as the Metro Code. So I can look at that provision and I'll speak up in just a few moments.
Okay. We'll come back to that. Thanks. So in terms of what I'm hearing is that this is the right priority. That continuation and the proposal on the table of setting it at a cap and increasing it with inflation might be a starting point for our conversation. And we would like to find out how we're going to manage within that cap. And counselors will come back with our COO with a recommendation on how to proceed when we have both sets of staff out of this bucket, as well as what is the overall programmatic level of staffing needs throughout the time.
Thank you.
Does that sound accurate? Okay. All right, we'll move on to the next slide. Thanks. So this is the ongoing services and rental assistance, the main core of the program, as we all know it. But obviously having it as second priority, but really the first priority in terms of funding the programs. And what we're trying to do here is make it the priority, but also make sure that we're stabilizing the amount of money so that we're not in this boom and bust cycle as we go through with the volatility of this measure. And obviously it also, by having the extension, avoids the service funding cliff in 2031 that we are headed into. So as you think about this, is it the correct priority to have it second? And by having it be stabilized with a cap, that we'll get into what the cap is with our CFO's presentation. But is that the way you want to kind of see it line up? Any comments? Councilor Gonzalez, then Councilor Nolan.
Great. So we're, and just to be clear, we're talking about the supportive housing bucket. We're talking about the next bucket. Sorry,
Yep.
like I saw the slides move, so I was a little.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, right now, I know me and many of my council colleagues are talking to providers and cities and hearing a lot of great feedback. And I want to acknowledge that there is a real concern about the threat of losing the momentum on the buildup of the programming that we've been able to do over the last few years. So I consciously do not want to jeopardize any of the momentum that we've made in capital investments on shelters, access centers, service infrastructure that is necessary to truly support folks that are the most vulnerable and are experiencing chronic homelessness. At a high level, to me, is like, given the volatility, what is the right number, the floor for us to have to supporting the population A investments over time? That's kind of one of the first questions that comes to me. And also, President Peterson, one of the things that you've said throughout this process that's really resonating with me is that SHS is dollar for dollar per capita the largest investment that any community is making in themselves to address this. And so, like, I want our region, our system, to be industrious about how we leverage that money, whether it's state funds, federal dollars. And there's a lot of questions about one of those buckets given the new administration. So I think continuing to evaluate how we can use this money as a tool to leverage even the state to bring even more resources here. I hear mixed things about how that might be happening or not be happening from a state formula perspective. So yeah, I think first priority is the Pop A stability for me. Original mission. Sure.
Thank you, Councilor Nolan.
Thank you. This seems to me to be the bucket where we say we are changing the nature of this program from responding to a crisis that we will fix to establishing an ongoing set of services. And I think we need somehow to acknowledge that. And I don't know where that happens, but I think the nature of what we're putting in front of the voters is very different than what we put in front of them in May of 2020. Those of you who visit me in my office know that I've got the lawn sign from that campaign that says, "End our homeless crisis." This measure says that may be our intent, but it's not clear. And if it is our intent, what part of this extension will achieve that goal and what part will be ongoing maintenance? And since we're talking in buckets, this seems to be the bucket where that conversation should happen.
Yeah, and I just want to acknowledge, I think the inherent question in what I get out of having talked to you about this previously and what I'm hearing from others is there was an emergency and a crisis of high proportion in COVID, in lockdown. And a lot of folks need to move through the system, but what is the rate at which they leave the system? And you're actually at a maintenance need of just what's happening in the regular economics that's not part of COVID. What does that mean? Maintenance of a program look like? And how does that relate to moving money into affordable housing so that there's actually a place to house people? How do you have that entirety of the system and how do you plan for that? And I think that's part of the bigger question of getting to a homeless and housing regional action plan. But I do think that PSU could probably help us answer at least what's going on nationally and what people are finding in order to ensure that we are not jeopardizing any of the programs and jeopardizing anybody not getting services, to finding out where different populations are at and how long they take to move through the system in general. Everybody has their own background. Everybody has their own individual story and their own individual needs, but generally I'm pretty sure they can be grouped into folks who have similar circumstances and find out like what is their average need of length of services. So I think we can ask for some help before we make a final decision and getting some sort of information around that.
Madam President, and we may have different perspectives on this. The people I listen to hear from a lot about this are not engaged on a day-to-day to implement the program. They're on their way to work, on their way to their kids' school, to church or grocery shopping, and they see a world that they think they voted to change from a humanitarian point of view as well as a visible point of view. And this measure says, we're not going to get it done in the 10 years we asked you for initially. So I think we need to address their expectation that we would. We can argue about whether that was a realistic expectation. I think we would find that people thought they were voting to end the homeless crisis, which the advocates said we would do. And I think both for transparency and also, frankly, for support among voters, we need to address when and how that will happen and when and how a long-term foundation, when we get to that.
Or be more clear about what this pot of money is supposed to accomplish. Because the counties and the state are in control of the actual full programming. And this is part of the full picture, but it's only a small portion in comparison. So how do we articulate better what this pot of money does and will achieve? I think,
And a 25-year
Yep.
term. 25 years is an entire career for a lot of people.
yep,
And it's forever for the voters.
yep. Thank you. Councilor Lewis.
Sure, thank you. So I think generally with this bucket, I'm in agreement that it's at the right place in terms of priority order. I do think semantically, it's important to call it, you said the word cap earlier, and I would not say that word.
It's a
I-
base level of allocation.
Yeah, I look at it as the guaranteed minimum funding, and it's a pot of money that no matter what happens, no matter the forecast, no matter what disaster comes our way, we have modeled that that is a guarantee, and it is a corpus that is going to be divided to the 3 counties directly, and they can rely on it, and they are not required to do side accounts, savings, regional fund set-asides out of it. That is for their plan. And I think it's important to reference the plan because they need to stick to their local implementation plan. And we need those local implementation plans to be better. They need to be strategies and not just lists of fundable activity. And we will, this is going to get to the governance, but we will look to that bucket as being spent to that plan. And it will be spent to that plan in the population A and population B proportions laid out originally in the measure. Reminder that the population A folks should be getting about 3/4 of the resource, and they are the people who are living most acutely, street homeless, and a disability. These are folks who need our help the most, and we need to stay the course with this base level of funding on the folks who we absolutely have the most responsibility to help first and foremost. But outside of the semantics and the double underscore there, right priority.
Agreed. It gets to the stability of what we're trying to accomplish because again, there's a boom and bust cycle to the volatility. And programming for a boom, knowing that there's a high probability that there will need to be cuts in 1 year. And we have no idea how big or how small those cuts could be, is problematic to making progress. So I think you're spot on, a minimum guarantee. Yeah. And of course, all of these other buckets we're talking about, the counties are also eligible for, except for the city's program, whether that be affordable housing or whether that be unanticipated revenue that comes in a good year that could go back to SHS type funding. So, all right, Councilor Rosenthal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to agree in general with the comments made by Councilor Lewis. I think how we phrase it is fairly important, particularly to the counties who have a primary responsibility in many regards. In other words, a guaranteed minimum with the caveat that we not control all the external factors that could happen to, shall we say, wreck the economy and cause a much greater inflow than we currently have. But I also want to echo a little bit of what Councilor Nolan said. I think we need to distinguish the fact that there's a housing or a houselessness crisis, and then there's a houselessness problem. We've always had a houselessness problem. When I first moved here in 61, there were a lot of people living on the streets, and these were mostly veterans from the war, and we had no programs for them. I don't know, they just sort of lived there, and they lived along the river and so forth. But some of this will always remain. We will always have some people going in and some people going out, so we have a constant problem. But we have had, because of the pandemic, and we could have more, we're going to have to build some flexibility into this to realize that we may solve the crisis and get it to being just a sort of a continual problem, but we could have another crisis. And so we have to have the flexibility in the funding and in the programming so that we can actually address new crises as they arise, a new influx for various reasons, whether it's, people who sought refugee asylum or something like that. There's a lot of situations that could come up. So I think we have to do that. And then I think just a sort of minor thing, in the buckets, I think we need to attach the bucket, this first bucket with the second, well, actually it's the second bucket with the third bucket, to show that we realize that providing services without housing is equally as useless as providing housing without services. And I think that sometimes we don't emphasize enough.
To being able to tie the needs together and show what is it going to take in order to be able to achieve the goal. Thank you. Councilor Juan, and then Simpson, and then Gonzalez.
Thank you, Madam President. And, I would also like to echo my support for having this bucket and the minimum baseline funding. And I think that accomplishes a couple of things. I think in this sector, reducing volatility is critical. And, as, Councilor Nolan mentioned, I don't want to be reading headlines every year for the rest of my career that the county's underspent or overspent. If we don't establish that, baseline, then, some years we'll see that we exceeded expectations and collected more money. And then we'll expect, those funds to be spent effectively. But what that really does is create a drive or desire to do one-time investments, which, may or may not be the best use of those dollars, because, in boom years, we won't be able to support ongoing programs in perpetuity. So what do you do with those one-time funds that are, kind of extra? I think that's something for, HPAC or whomever to consider, because we can't, make that an ongoing expense, for the rest of the measure. And I think also having that predictability allows us to support kind of the next bucket in terms of housing production. Like if we're able to plan for long-term rent assistance, for a longer period of time, that makes the production of housing more possible, because that can be, factored into pro forma. So I do think setting that established baseline has a lot of different benefits, both for the program and for housing production.
Thank you. I think I'll just interject here. I think part of what also needs to be re-emphasized when we think about the reform to this measure is that the purpose of this was to regionalize the system. And I think the counties are working very hard to try and create systems within the counties. But it's taking longer to get to regionalization of an entire system, so that no matter where you enter the system, whether it is asking for temporary shelter or permanent supportive housing or asking for help, you should be automatically enrolled, not just within the county, but within the system. So I feel like we need to be more clear about what types of impact, like what do we want in this long-term end product is we need a regional system. Councilor Simpson.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to say this. I know that I wasn't here during the crafting of this measure, but, and it was made during a time of great need and crisis. However, I don't want us to lose the sight that we said 10 years without having a full system to receive folks to help people transition. And right now, this program is set just for programs. And we would, if it stayed structured in this way right now, we would still be having this conversation 10 years from now, because we actually haven't built out a system to help transition and move people out of homelessness. That said, I support moving towards this bucket system as proposed, because it protects the critical base funding for the counties to provide services from that volatility. And I know it's challenging to figure out the right size for the county's base budget, because there simply isn't enough money in the system overall. But we need to figure out what that amount is, so we can program out things for years to come on that front. But also, as I think about this, providing this level of base support in this bucket, so that when we have some overspill into the next bucket, which is our affordable housing and supportive housing, like that's the piece that has really been the gap in my observation around things, is like, where are we going to send folks? And I I'm going to use a really, really concrete example. I remember during my time as working in a nonprofit space at the Rosewood, I remember when folks would have mental health crisis challenges or they were homeless and dealing with that stuff, police would bring them to our center, and we had no way of we had no training in dealing with those issues. And then, to layer on top of that, there, right down the street from the Rosewood, it was a women's shelter. And every day, they have to clean the shelter up in the mornings. And the women would come to the center every day, and we became a day shelter without any SHS dollars, without any support, any training. And so we had to learn how to by responding in community need, how to respond back to our community as it showed up. And I want to make sure that those kinds of things are not falling in the cracks, that folks and organizations are able to work with our SHS providers in this program bucket, because we have the general Pop A buckets, and they go more so towards service around how we engage with folks and get them moved into shelter space, et cetera, et cetera. But there are other issues that are taking place beneath the surface that we have to have conversation around, particularly with our NGOs and CBOs. So thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Counselor Gonzalez?
Thanks, President Peterson. I have a few more things come to mind as folks were talking, and I really think the focus on volatility and stability is of paramount importance for this. And one of the things that I know I've been talking about is, a mere extension of this measure is the baseline of stability for this funding, to extend it like Councilor Wong talked about. And to that point too, I think that it will be important for us as we continue to talk with the counties, is thinking through a transition window from the current program to a new program. Can't just be like a light switch that immediately disrupts the funding, right? So I want to make sure that we talk about that and create space for folks in the system that are working in the system to inform that. And at a high level too, I'm trying to approach this process that we're undergoing through kind of my background lens too of econ, through supply demand, inflow, outflow, all of those things. And I just really hope that as this process goes forward and we see an HPEC, that they have a role in accelerating our housing goals, our housing production goals. We can't have a revolving door supportive housing services system that doesn't truly help people ultimately get into the PSH unit or the deeply affordable unit. And that is a role that I think our region has shown that we can be really effective in. We're facing an affordable housing production cliff, which I know this is not the bucket that we're talking about right now, but to me, they're like a yin and yang in terms of of how we do that. But we also just need to support our building sector to deliver units across working class families and whatnot, to take care of the problem. So looking through the inflow and outflow is going to be really important.
Thank you. There are a series of questions that we will get into with Brian's presentation, and that includes the transition time, because that does allow us to talk about the impact to the counties as they move to a new state of funding. Also, the cost escalation, whether it's our 3% assumption or if there's another assumption that folks want to talk about. And then the base level of funding is what we'll get into next with Brian's presentation. But I do want to also point out that the one thing we haven't talked about is that we all struggled at the beginning at Clackamas County waiting until they knew exactly how much that they were going to have, and they actually budget to the year prior so they know how much is actually come in instead of budgeting to a projected number. And I think part of what we've been talking about is how do we move more to that model as a region, so that even if there is a minimum going into this bucket, if in case that ever were to slip below the revenue, that we would still be budgeting to the past years instead of a projected, which I think also gets to the stabilization issue that we are having right now. All right, let's move on to the next bucket. Oh, Councilor Rosenthal, I apologize.
I just have a question that historical, maybe it's my memory that is not serving me. I do not remember what budgeting instructions we gave the counties at the start. In other words, I know we have this problem of one county budgeting one way and another county budgeting another way and a third county budgeting a third way. Did we provide them, I mean, is part of the problem our lack of, I mean, we didn't have much staff at that point in time. Is part of the problem the fact that we didn't give them clear guidance?
Councilor Rosenthal, the short answer is no. The number one, I think the really important takeaway is that Metro doesn't dictate how the counties budget. Counties have their own processes and responsibilities under Oregon law to set their own budgets. And we have never tried to kind of override that authority, nor could we. The most important thing is our IGAs with the counties that we negotiated with the counties specified the manner in which they were to budget those resources. And the counties, frankly, have taken some different approaches regardless of what we negotiated with them in the IGA.
So they have not been in compliance with their IGAs?
Probably not. I mean, according to the technical terms of the IGA, there are some pretty clear instructions around how they were to budget funds, and the counties have taken different approaches over the years, you know, and for not unreasonable reasons.
Okay.
Councilor Lewis, did you have anything to add to that?
I think our staff gave the professional answer. I think the historical answer was at least one county didn't believe our budget projection, and they used that disbelief or uncertainty to stall conversations about how they were going to get going on a program when they didn't have any funds in their current bank account. And it took us many months, and we did actually offer a loan and give them a loan, and then they didn't actually spend that loan. So there were multiple things happening there.
Thank you. All right, we'll move quickly through these next ones because I think everybody wants to get to the actual numbers is what I'm feeling. The real part of this is just getting the priority order and what you want to see as services within each of these. So the affordable housing, next slide, affordable housing and PSH. Again, trying to avoid the upcoming funding cliff and maintain a pipeline of production for housing, affordable housing, low-income housing, because we also need to reduce and prevent homelessness by pairing the services with these lowest income households in housing. So this bucket is intended to fund that building, acquisition, and preservation of affordable housing and permanent supportive housing. We've also heard from the cities that they would like to be able to access this money for SDC waivers and other capital improvements. And so I just want to note that, that's what we've heard from the cities. The principles of this bucket would be to be flexible and responsive and avoid that upcoming cliff, and to continue the flow of money into affordable and permanent supportive housing systems in the entirety of the region to mitigate the concern about losing momentum. It supports the goals of homelessness reduction and prevention if focused on serving lowest income individuals. Try to be responsive to feedback from the service providers, business community advocates about the need to continue this work. And again, the advocates and through Here Together and Portland Metro Chamber support the pre-development costs as well as construction, acquisition, and preservation of affordable housing in this bucket. And again, we heard from the city's SDC waivers would be nice to have in there as well for affordable and long-term housing. So Council, are there any principles or goals you want to see reflected in this bucket that have not been mentioned? Is it in the right place? And what types of investments would you like to see eligible for this funding per our feedback from advocates and cities? Yeah, Councilor Wong.
Oh, great, thank you. Madam President, I think, just following up on our conversation around services, I don't believe we're going to be able to just purely service our way out of this crisis. Like, folks are still going to need a place to live, whether that's in PSH or in later on affordable units or even market rate or workforce housing. I think we need housing at all income levels, and I think that's something that this bucket could really, benefit from some conversation at a future governance HPAC table about how we want to allocate those potential resources. But I do know right now that there's a lot of developers that are unable to complete or advance, projects in terms of affordable or market rate housing. So I think there's some real deals and opportunities out there that are worth exploring. And yeah, having a bucket of resources to, spur and continued development of affordable housing is, I think, part of that solution. I don't know if I added anything, but just my hot takes.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Lewis.
Sure, thank you. I think it's really important to recognize that there are so many different ways that government money touches deeply affordable housing, and in particular, permanent supportive housing, shorthand PSH. And PSH is at least a threefold investment of dollars like these, right? It's the dollars to actually build the thing or buy the thing. And then once you have the thing, it's dollars to buy down the rent. And then once you've bought down the rent, it's additional dollars to service the building itself. And on top of that, dollars to help serve people. And I think right now, we do see investments from this measure going into PSH through the buy down of rents and through services. But at some point, we will not have enough billings. And so it's most critical that we think through strategies in order to continue to have places where we can invest in people and in creating communities where people can stabilize. So in order to move forward, I do think we should recognize PSH with a particular asterisk that needs to be considered. That said, on a 2-decade-long horizon, we cannot only invest in PSH, and we will need to build particularly 0 to 30s, some affordable home ownership, all of those things that are in the spectrum that need the affordable investments. And we shouldn't limit ourselves, but upfront, we have to be really sincere in our desire to target towards PSH and 0 to 30 units that are most integrated into stabilizing the folks served by this program.
Thank you. Councilor Gonzalez and Rosenthal.
Yeah, thanks, President Peterson. Super similar line of thinking to what folks on the council have said already. The deeply affordable and PSH connection to helping folks exit, stabilize, receive the care and wraparounds that are needed in centralized facilities is super important. And something that I think should be prioritized and called out as we continue to evaluate this bucket. I was having a conversation with someone out in Forest Grove yesterday, and we were talking through kind of like general inflow into homelessness, general outflow, and they made a connection that helped me reframe some things in my mind in a way that, the affordable housing investments that we can make are just as important for decreasing the inflow and reducing the cost and the burden that folks have in their general budgets. So I think having that paired with some of the programs that have proven successful throughout the first few years of iteration of the measure will be really important. So although we do have a priority in PSH deeply affordable, I want to kind of put my hat in there and say, continuing to create those pathways for folks to stabilize, like Councilor Lewis said, affordable homeownership opportunities. Those should all be flexible and opportunity within this 20-25 year horizon of a measure. So, yeah.
Thank you, Councilor Rosenthal, and then Nolan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I want to concur with Councilor Lewis. I think she correctly identified the kinds of ongoing costs and things that we have and expenditures that we have to anticipate. I was surprised to learn at the forum that in Washington County, there's about 1,000 units that are going to be coming necessary for preservation coming up in the next few years because they're going to be coming off of their 30-year protection. I don't know if that's true in all the counties. The situation may be different. There's 3 different buckets. There's preservation, there's conversion, and then there's new construction. New construction is always going to be a lot more expensive generally, but the situation is going to be different in each county and each community. So I think we have to look at the efficiency. I think that's one of the things we have to look at, the efficiency of number of units, but we also have to look at their location. And we also, obviously, we're going to continue to keep our TOD focus so that where TOD can be leveraged in this is going to be important. So I think it's sort of a complex process going forward, but we're going to have to have an adequate way to assess these efficiencies, these location things continuing going forward. And it's going to require a lot of detailed work and partnership on the part of the providers, the financial people, the transportation people, as well as the county housing authorities and the city housing authorities.
Yeah, so noted. I feel completely overwhelmed now. But I think that just thinking of the need for preservation of housing that is coming to the end of its agreed life as low-income housing, the construction of all housing and how our governance conversation is going to get into this a little bit more about how do we coordinate regionally between all 23, 24 cities and the 3 counties to get to a plan to be able to, so that I don't feel so overwhelmed about what you just said, Councilor Rosenthal, in terms of we have so much need out there. And we have to find a way through this conversation to get to the other side so we can actually start working on the entirety of the complexity of the problem. So thank you. Councilor Nolan.
Thank you. It's quite a conundrum in my mind about how we meet a compelling humanitarian need or long-term housing stability for those of our neighbors who are at the lowest income levels, while simultaneously slowing down, dare we even imagine trying to reverse the persistent escalation of market rate housing for median income households, for working families. And I don't know what we've done to understand those dynamics. When we provide temporary, more importantly, when we provide long-term rent assistance, one household, not even a drop in the bucket for the region. But as it becomes an integral part of our strategy, I can't help but think, and the economists among us should analyze this, are we inadvertently creating or prolonging some of the problem we're trying to fix by artificially buoying up the market rate for housing? Because if we're giving a check to a family to stay in a house, in an apartment or a rental house, that check's not helping them buy groceries. It's going into the pocket of the owner of that property. And what are we doing in this ongoing program to limit or eliminate, but at least limit the detrimental effect effect that our actions will have on the market as a whole? It's a real question. I don't know. I think it comes under this bucket. Similarly, we hear from providers and our friends at the counties and our friends in nonprofits that the population of homelessness is a dynamic statistic. People exit homelessness, they get on track, they get stabilized. People fall, have a medical bankruptcy, and so they fall into homelessness. Individuals become addicted to some kind of substance, alcohol, recreational drugs, whatever, and they fall into homelessness. There's an urban myth element to this next statement, but I don't think it's entirely myth. And that is, in a world that will start on January 20th, 2025, do we make investments that incentivize, maybe even guarantee, that the in-migration of people needing this kind of help swamps our capacity to meet it? And how does the measure, how do the proposed changes address that? There's a humanitarian need, and I respond to it like we all do here. There's also a question of, does this Portland region want to be a destination of last resort for folks? I don't know if we've answered that yet.
I appreciate the question. I think it's definitely a question that's out there in the public that we need to get some sort of arms around before we put it out to the ballot measure in terms of what we know. And I'm sure that what the counties will say is the list is so long at this point, the waiting list on all of these services, that that might actually be a detriment to anybody new coming into the system or asking for help. So I don't know, but it's a good question, and we should ask. I'm going to move us on to the cities program and get through that so we can get to Brian's presentation, because again, we all really want to talk about these levels of investment. So the cities program has been asked for by the cities. There is a vastly different landscape in all three counties and how the counties and cities are working together. And they would like to know that they have some sort of funding to go to that is just for dealing with the costs of working and servicing the homeless population in each of the cities. That they don't have to go through the counties to actually get funds for, that would just be a stable supply of money on the things that they are asking for help on. And I don't have that list handy. Val, do you have that list handy of that one PowerPoint that we had? And we can just read it off. Maybe you can just help me read it off. I'll give you a moment. Yeah. They have asked for everything from help to be able to fund their local pantry that's helping feed homeless folks, to everything to helping with their own local shelters, to programs that they have internally to work with the homeless population. Some of that is outreach coordinators, and some of that is even public safety. Mm-hmm. So they have asked, they have a list, we'll get that. So we can just read it off to you and just get your initial thoughts. But this program, to me, would be much more around kind of a grant program. And if we included the list of allowed uses and be very clear about it, I think that would make them feel like they've been heard and understood that there is a significant cost to the cities to helping with this problem and working directly with the homeless. So we'll get that in a second. But I guess the questions for this are, the goals are ongoing and consistent funding for the cities, serving at a community scale to make an impact. And we can talk about the level of funding in a minute, but just to give you an idea, Clackamas County gave out $7.5 million, $7 million.
About 7 million, keeping in mind that included some cities outside of metro service area, obviously using their base dollars, not our dollars.
Yeah, so that's a total of 7 with their base dollars and the SHS. What the cities have reported to us and the counties would count money differently. As the cities believe that in Washington County that they've received $350,000 for a coordinated outreach director in 3 cities. And in, am I getting that wrong? $200,000 in Washington County and $350,000 in East Multnomah County. Small cities outside the city of Portland. So they're looking at the disparity between the 3 and would like a more robust program to deal with the issues they're facing.
I have heard the number $600,000 from Washington County. But still, there's an order of magnitude question there.
Yeah. Depends on what you're counting. Yeah. So any first thoughts on a city's program? Councilor Nolan and then Gonzalez.
You mentioned outside the city of Portland, and I, on behalf of my constituents and on behalf of the largest portion of the people needing this service, qualifying under population A, for example, I can't support a program that does not include the city of Portland. City of Portland has more residents than the next 6, 7, 8 largest cities in the region, and to exclude them, that's not even counting concentration of people eligible for services, needing services. So I'm fine with a city's program if it includes a proportional allocation for the city of Portland. If it excludes the city of Portland on the basis that they're big enough they can pay their own bills, my response would be they're big enough and they have the services that draw people in and create a disproportionate responsibility for the city to provide services.
Yeah, and I didn't say that the city of Portland would be not included in this. I think the question was,
I'm just putting a
yeah, no, I hear you.
declaration on
And I
the
think
table.
it gets to the question, is that the cities would actually like a direct allocation, but that's where we've run into clarity and transparency and accountability issue just within the SHS program. And so a grant program is where what kind of model I was thinking of. I just heard you say direct allocation or allocation in conformance to the size of the population. And I just want to be clear the way I see this, because there isn't a lot of money to play with by the time you start allocating this out, is a grant program would probably be a better way to go with some sort of like base amount of cap that would go to each grant, like no more than 500,000 or something. So I just want to give you a size or proportion.
If it's designed to benefit small cities, then I don't support it
Okay.
at the expense of the cities, including Portland, but a few other large cities that, because of the services available in those cities, become places where folks needing those services congregate.
Councilor Gonzalez, then Rosenthal and Simpson.
Yeah, thanks, President Peterson. Yeah, on this, I think there's a lot of things we can evaluate, which is, I think for me, first and foremost, is thinking about like what is the role of it, of this grant program, and if it's to duplicate services that the county should be doing, then I think that's the wrong approach. You know, the role of the counties is to be providers of public health and social services and things like that.
You want me to quick go through the list of things that they submitted they would like covered?
If you like, yeah.
Okay, I don't mean to cut you off. I just,
No.
I thought it might help. Services, they would like housing and service coordinators and outreach workers, their own programs providing necessities like food and toiletries, heating and cooling centers during severe weather events, shelter construction and permitting costs, emergency hotel vouchers, investments to create affordable housing, SDC and permitting costs, administration, implementation of city-approved housing production strategies, and supporting community safety and livability. That was the list of things that they would like covered. Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks. I was trying to write all of those out. I mean, I just kind of like coming straight out the gate, like this money to me is not paying for law enforcement. It's not paying for graffiti cleanups. To me, like the grant programs need to be additive towards the local implementation plans for the counties. And I feel pretty strongly about that. I also think that what the grant program should encourage to do, and this is happening, there's some examples out in Washington County where, the city of Tigard and the city of Tualatin created basically they're sharing an FTE to do a lot of these things. And I think that small cities could, work together to share FTE and some of these coordinated things. When I hear things like pay for, housing production strategies and things like that, I'm thinking of our planning department and different grants that we have. So again, like I know these are just high level things that we're sharing, but I think that the sweet spot would be for cities to work together under a coordinated grants and efforts for whether it's for the outreach to help. They want to do a review of their code to make it easier to site, permit all the things for affordable housing or for shelters. I think outside of that, when we're starting to talk about vouchers and we're starting to talk about other basic necessities programs, that starts to sound like a little bit of mission creep to what the providers and others are doing. And also, I mean, I think there is a tension, which for me is a slippery slope about money that goes to cities. I mean, we have small cities, we have large cities. And I think that's something for us to continue to evaluate in. I mean, I think we at least have 7 housing authorities, and those cities have a different level of scale. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, whether it's Beaverton, Gresham, Hillsborough, and the city of Portland, just innately, they receive different funds just for being at that scale. I think looking at the other cities that aren't at that scale, I don't know. I think we need to think about this at a high level, and ensuring that the money is not duplicative is important to me, because we shouldn't be diluting the impact that we can make by centralizing and focusing investments. A lot of this is off the cuff, but hope it inspires more conversation and hopefully pushback. So,
Thank you. Councilor Rosenthal?
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I have to say from the small city standpoint, I mean, I understand their perspective in the sense that they feel that they're in direct contact with populations that need to be served, and they have the most direct contacts in some cases. So I sort of understand that, and the fact that some of them have housing authorities. That list, I haven't had a chance to think about it. I think there are probably some things on there that probably fall outside of the scope that would be what Councilor Gonzalez calls mission creep. But I have 2 questions. First of all, it is my assumption that this bucket would be, correct me if I'm wrong, this bucket would be the first cut in terms of if we had an economic downturn and we all of a sudden had less revenue coming in, this would be the first bucket that would be cut, and it would, if it was competitive.
It would actually be the second. So, it literally wouldn't get filled, right? If there were there's a very low year of revenue collection, it would go first to the collection and admin, then it would go into the SHS, and then it would go to affordable housing. If there was nothing left over, there could be 0, there could be a lot, right?
Right, okay. Yeah, I just wanted to confirm that. And then, but my other question has to do with, I noticed none of the cities mentioned the concept of any programs, habitat-like programs of converting of developing habitat-like programs that lead toward ownership. And we haven't discussed that in any of the buckets. And so I'm just curious as to.
So I think we did, in terms of the affordable housing bond measure, or the housing, the affordable housing portion of what we're proposing. as well as the cities did ask for SDC waivers and that sort of thing to help defer costs. So that would be part of it. That is part of what Habitat does ask for.
So that would be in
For
both
instance.
buckets.
Hmm?
You're saying that could be a component in both buckets.
That we were discussing.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if it was being relegated entirely to the cities.
President Peterson?
Yeah,
If I may, we do currently through our affordable housing bond program, we have funded some affordable homeownership programs, and so have a model for that.
Yep.
Should council decide that you want that to be eligible.
I just want to make sure that specifically the SDCs and that sort of thing were included in both, and that the homeownership discussion was taking place in the conversation we just had. So,
Okay,
I mean, people put it on the table, so it's fine. Counselor Simpson and then Lewis and then Wong. And Counselor Nolan, I'm assuming that you've already spoken. I'm sorry. Your hand is still up. Okay.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to come back to this piece around the small cities or the cities grant. And the reason this whole conversation for me came up is because of the letters I submitted to on public record from our cities out in East County that aren't getting any responses out of the joint office or Multnomah County when it comes to SHS and the support for those dollars. And I believe the three cities, Childdale, Fairview, Wood Village, excluding Gresham, I think they requested a total budget amount of like $1.3 million just to do the services on the ground in their community. And I believe Multnomah County awarded them like 350. And so that's a huge gap, a huge disconnect, but also it's not, if we're talking in the spirit that we've been talking, that's not a huge sum of money to ask for in terms of like providing those services on the ground that they can do. And I'm also in agreements with, and I think we need a further conversation around like what is allowed, because I agree with Councilor Gonzalez that we can't be using this for graffiti cleanup or law enforcement and things like that. But it really does have to target those city functions that via their lanes, they can adequately be a support and service, a supportive service in addressing homelessness at the local level in which they operate in. And so I'm supportive of this. And that's the whole reason this came up is because I believe also too, like, let's just be real. You can't have, if it's a regional program, you can't have some cities getting city allocation while others are just looking out or barely getting nothing. And I think that this puts us on path of making sure that this program and specifically this part of the bucket is a regional program that supports, again, in further conversation, what's a small city, what's a medium-sized city, how do we allocate for Beaverton and Portland, but also making sure that we take care of our smaller cities that are facing the brunt of this without any real coordination or support from those counties.
Thank you. Counselor Lewis?
Sure, thank you. I am supportive of the city's bucket. I think we keep holding up Clackamas County a little bit as a straw person example of something that seemingly went well. While I was also talking to one of the mayors in my community yesterday who keeps a level of frustration that it's being held up as something that went well when there's still an IGA negotiation that is ongoing, almost as long as ours with counties, not quite, and no money yet. So I think that if we are going to do city bucket, we have to have an easy to understand, simplified process with grants that move timely. And I think that we are going to be able to focus best if we focus on the level of services that are already part of the strategic plans, the LIPs. They're just being provided at different locations. So nonprofits open up brick or mortar, or they get a van and they drive around. And in those two locations, either outside their van or on the street corner or at their nonprofit, they engage with people, they help them, they build trust, they build a relationship, and then they start offering services. then you have the opportunity to look at some folks who need this help are already coming to city services. They're already sitting at a library to take advantage of Wi-Fi and charging their phone. They're already sitting at City Hall to get some AC or some heat. Why not free up some of the time of the city workers who are already there, who are best able to build on that trust and that relationship? So that's where I want to see the money really focused on where we're meeting people where they already are.
Thank you. Counselor Wong, and then we'll close this part of the conversation and turn it over to Brian.
Okay, thank you, Madam President. I think the overall goal that we all want is a regional system. And I do think cities play a role in that regional system. And I want to make sure that we, get there. But just like mechanically how this is set up, I have a mixed feelings about this specific bucket. And it's because over the course of the next, 30 years, we might experience downturns or recessions. And being so far down the waterfall in the bucket, that just means that there'll be years or many years in a row where cities might not have any funding available through this directly. And that means because of that, again, like my point in all this was reducing volatility. So I don't feel in good conscience we can go out to cities and be like, we might have a grant program, some years yes, some years no. That's not a way to build sustained support. So cities should play a role, but I think it needs to be for things that advance that regional system kind of in bucket one, so they have some predictability. I don't know what the governance looks like in that, but I don't want us to be in a place where, sorry cities next year because there's no money this year, because I do think cities do play an important part, but they shouldn't be so far down the waterfall. It's just my personal thoughts.
Yeah, I've struggled with that as well. I think the ask from the cities is to, again, make sure that the money gets out the door as quickly as possible, that it does provide the ability probably for several years of funding because they do have their own shelters that are not necessarily being funded out of the SHS that they've set up themselves. So, and then if there's a proposal that's kind of new and not in the list, how does that get, a funding or consideration through HPAC? And how do we make sure that the services are coordinated if it's not in the list, right? That's a pre-approved upfront. So what does that process look like? So I think, I also struggle with the cities kind of being the last here. But as we get into the size of the funding and money in the next conversation, Councilor Gonzalez, did you have something to quickly add?
Yes, I know you wanted to close the conversation, but I had a question to add here. And just real quick, building off what Councilor Wong was saying, like we do want to build a regional system. And so my hope is that the money is set up in a way that encourages collaboration, not says, all right, I have my money, now I'm going to do my thing, whatever the county's doing. So I think that's really important for us to figure out through this oversight structure and the way that it rolls out. So my question is would this funding be, managed and awarded by Metro? Would it be funded by the counties to the city within the county? Would it be a grant program to HPAC? I mean, what have been the general tenor of the conversations, or where do you feel the agreement is around that?
I feel like the cities would like it to be direct funding from HPAC and not through the counties.
Okay.
To be crystal clear.
Hmm.
All right, the last bucket we'll just go over is the catch-all. If revenue is high enough that it fully funds the administrative services and costs related to revenue collection, if it completely fills the SHS bucket and then completely fills affordable housing and the city's program, in what order whatever order we end up with there, then the conversation has been around HPAC being able to then reallocate more money into each of those buckets based on need. So I'm just gonna say, let's just leave it at that for now. If you have any ideas, thoughts, get those to me about that last catch-all. And I'm gonna turn it over to Brian to talk about the actual numbers and the scenarios that we've been talking around the table with the stakeholders with. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Council President Peterson. And we're going to bring the slide deck back up. Thank you. So I'm going to run through some scenarios. A couple really important caveats before I start. Number one, you're going to see some bar charts going out a number of years. This is not a forecast. These are scenarios where we tried to model historical patterns of volatility for a couple of reasons. Number one, all of these scenarios extend beyond the length of the period of time where we forecast. We do a 5-year forecast. And number two, as you know, we've mentioned, the word of the day is volatility. It is really hard, if not impossible, to actually try to predict that. So we're trying to model some scenarios that show how would this sort of system perform in a variety of different economic conditions, rather than give you a forecast of the specific one that we might think happen, because that's not possible. The second thing I want to note is that through all of this work, I think there's been some talk about reducing volatility. That is not an achievable outcome. We're talking about managing volatility. There is no way to reduce the inherent volatility in the system because it's related to the forms of taxation that we're using. We are going to experience volatility. How do we manage it in a way to prioritize the funding of some services and programs over others in years when we experience revenue downturns? Let's go to the next slide, please. So just for a baseline, this is current law. And so all these charts are formatted the same way. The orange bars in the bottom are Metro administrative costs and tax collection. The dark blue bars are the base county expenditures or the supportive housing services funding. The green bars on top are the regional investment fund, that 5% set aside that the current law requires the counties to hold. You can see here, there are no additional allocations or distributions. There are no changes to the tax rate. Tax collections essentially stop after fiscal year 31. There will be a tail. Money will come in for years in relatively small amounts, but there will not be funding to sustain programs in any significant way beyond the original sunset of the program. Next slide, please. So an overview of the assumptions. So we have 2 sets of scenarios. First, indexing is implemented for tax year 2026 and beyond. Again, we're growing those income thresholds to ensure roughly the same groups of people continue paying the tax. We assumed inflation at 3% per year for all expenditures and buckets. I'll say inflation at 3%. That is over what most economists would project is the actual rate of inflation. It's also below what most governments experience on a regular basis for increases in their cost of service. That's just a fact of life. So we picked a number in the middle. In some cases, it may be too low. Some cases, it may be too high. This assumes the sunset out to 2050. The changes in the personal income tax rate for fiscal years 26 through 30, that personal income tax rate drops from 1% to 0.9%. And then from fiscal 2031 and beyond, it's at 0.75%. There is no change to the business income tax in any of these scenarios. When you look at the impact of those reductions across the entire SHS revenue stream, it's about a 5.5% reduction for those first 5 years and 13.75% for the remainder of the program. So it's a 10% and 25% drop, cumulative 25% drop in the rate, but the actual revenue impact is lower than that. Next slide, please. So scenario 1 sets those initial county allocations and admin and tax collection at that $250 million threshold. We picked that number because that was what the program was originally planned to receive. The initial housing allocation is set at 50 million, that grows with inflation. The initial city allocation up to 15 million, growing with inflation. And then whatever's left over is in that additional available for allocation. The addition to this chart So again, we have the orange bars, which are admin and tax collection. The blue bars are the base county expenditures. You'll notice the regional investment fund goes away after fiscal 26. The magenta bar is the amount available for allocation. So after you set that county baseline based on a $250 million revenue target, what's left over? And the kind of the weird shaded amount for the first 5 years shows the impact of the tax relief, the indexing and the rate reduction. That's foregone revenue. We drop that from the rest of the chart because the lower tax rate is baked in from that point on. The table at the bottom shows a range of estimates of what we might collect or what might be available for allocations in those new buckets. We're showing a range because we actually modeled a variety of different scenarios, assuming different types of volatility. These scenarios all use historical volatility experienced by the state of Oregon in its personal income tax collections, and then we cut it in half. Smoothed out some of the really anomalous years. The state of Oregon has tended to be kind of more volatile than the country as a whole. So we thought that was a pretty good model for kind of a thought exercise around what we might generate. So for the first 5 years under this new model, you can see housing in some scenarios, there is no money generated in some years with a really low revenue collection up to, we think, in the $42 million range. Cities, again, in most of the scenarios, this is, very little money at this level of detail. 0 to 2.4 million is functionally zero. There might be a year where there's a little extra money, but it's not something I would count on. And in no scenario in the first 5 years is there money in that last bucket for reallocation. When you look out 5 years beyond that, and again, this is not a forecast. This is not, we're not banking on this by any means. You still have some years where there is no money generated for housing or for cities or additional resources. But there are some higher years when you are able to fill those housing buckets and the city buckets get filled and there is money left over for additional resources. This is a good illustrative example. One of the things the counties in particular have noted that moving from fiscal 26 to 27, there's a pretty significant drop. And that trying to do that transition in 1 year would be really challenging. So if we go to the next slide, this phases in that same set of assumptions over 3 years. So basically everything is the same, except that county allocation from fiscal 26 steps down more slowly, getting to kind of their new base allocation in fiscal year 29. So there is a slower transition, and then the county allocation again grows with inflation out of fiscal 29. The impact of that in the first 5 years is there would be less money available for housing, very likely no money available for cities, and no money for additional resources. The second 5 years of this scenario, there is no change because the transition period would be fully implemented in the first 5 years. Any questions on this scenario before we move on to the next set? Councilor Wong.
Thank you. And as you're going forward in the modeling, how are you taking into account like potential economic downturns? Like, does that show up in the model over the?
If you look at that chart, for example, look at fiscal 31, 32. That bar is below fiscal 30, 31. So in this, basically we took volatility the state experienced in the past and then pretended that happened again. So this is trying to demonstrate what it might look like in a world where we experience that same level of volatility. There will be years where actual revenue is lower than the year before. This is not like property taxes that grow pretty consistently 3% a year, regardless of what's happening in the world.
And have there been periods of time where there's been multiple years of downturn in the past? I think that's one of the catastrophic things that, It's
Yes.
just like,
I mean, I think if you,
decreasing revenues for many years.
if you look at the Great Recession, for example, I mean, there was a big shock right away and then, decreases and or stagnant growth for several years. That's not an uncommon pattern in Oregon.
And Ryan, we're setting the counties at the 250 to the first year of the program and then inflating up. So it's not as though they're being decreased to 250 million the year after the surpass.
Correct. So we took 250 million in year one, grew that with inflation, and kind of ran that out through the scenario.
Thank you.
Uh,
Counselor
but-
Rosenthal and then
Thank you.
Gonzalez.
Two quick questions. You mentioned setting the, I got purple bar, the amount for allocation for housing at 50 million. There's a number of them where the total, that and the relief fund is less than 50 million. So I'm not sure what that implies. That implies that it should be all purple, or the top, the reallocation should be based upon some percentage. I'm a little unclear there. And then this implies that the fifth bucket or the fourth bucket, tax fundraising, will cease to exist as a potential funding source after 31-32. Is that correct? That's what you're saying, that?
No, Counselor, the shaded bars on top are illustrative, showing the impact of the tax relief, how much revenue is foregone by lowering the rate and the indexing. That is baked into all future assumptions. So if it's easier, kind of just pretend that those bars don't exist. To the top of the magenta is the actual revenue that would be received in these scenarios.
All right. I wasn't sure whether so that's a slightly different metric.
Counselor, as the existing measure only goes to 2030. So anything that we would do beyond 2030 is not, it's a reset. It's a moment to reset. So rather than looking at as foregone revenue, we chose to say it was baked in from 2031 on.
Well, I just wanted to clarify that the top of the purple is the revenue forecast, and is basically what we think the revenue would be, which means that anytime when that purple bar is less than 50 million, there wouldn't be money for the last bucket.
The last two buckets.
Yeah, the
actually.
last two buckets, excuse me.
Yeah.
Okay.
And these, could you just talk about, again, how you created these scenarios and they are not projections or forecasts?
Right, this is not a forecast. This is, we kind of behind the scenes actually have a set of scenarios that model different assumptions around volatility, again, to try to see how much is available for allocation in a variety of different economic forecasts. We are not saying that we will not make a forecast about how much money is going to be available, how much the tax is going to generate in fiscal year 33, for example. It's just not kind of plausible to put together an accurate forecast that far out into the future. And I think one of the main takeaways, and as we go through the next set of scenarios to remember, again, if we start with that principle, we are not reducing volatility, we're managing volatility. Mm-hmm. And if our primary goal is creating stability for the counties around that supportive housing services bucket, it's what is the line where it appears under this allocation model that we could have a pretty reasonable a reasonable expectation that we would generate that level of revenue. We should not be using the word guarantee. Oregon has experienced some pretty significant swings over the years in terms of personal income tax collections. And I don't think we want to be in the position of saying that we ever think our assessment is accurate enough that we can be sure that we would provide a certain level of income. It's about kind of having a reasonable expectation that we can manage that volatility by drawing that line for the counties at a particular place.
Let me just clarify. 31-33, that drop is due to both our estimations are accounting for volatility as well as the projection of the tax rate decrease. Okay.
Yes.
I just want to clarify.
Counselor Gonzalez, and then we'll move on to the next scenarios to try and get through this.
Thanks, President Peterson. Asking a lot of questions here.
Okay.
I was smirking a little bit because you're I know you're a good econ guy and you're a math nerd. So in the back of my mind, I was like, what's the p-value on this forecast? But anyway, all right, cool, tough crowd.
We're scrappy.
Yeah, it's all right. I'm making jokes out here, Brian.
There's a small audience for statistics related jokes.
Yeah. The standard deviations, all that stuff. Yeah, I mean, I think seeing these numbers is sobering, and it's just like a also reality setting. So I appreciate that, and also the foregone revenue through if this council were to move forward, a reduction is like seen as a opportunity cost essentially to me. But I have So out in my district, I've had providers come up to me, folks come up to me because they're seeing presentations being made that we're looking to cut 50% or around like dramatic levels of funding to the county. And I'm looking at this chart and I'm trying to figure out how that could be possible. I mean, I'm not asking you to answer for anyone else outside of the graph that you've put together, but that just, do you have any insight or wisdom for
So
me?
could we get through the next scenario of where the line, what would happen if the line goes lower,
Okay,
right? And then Brian actually came up with a table that then shows the different scenarios and the actual allocation differences.
man, y'all are prepared.
No,
Okay,
no.
great, thank you.
I'm clairvoyant suddenly. But go ahead, Brian.
Oh, no, I'm ready to move on if you are.
Yep.
Yeah, let's do it. Thank you.
Next slide. So scenario 2 sets the initial county allocation at 225 million, and then that backs out metro administration and tax collections on top of that. The housing allocation and the city allocation are the same at 50 and 15 million, those buckets growing with inflation. The takeaway here is if you look at the chart from fiscal 25-26 to 26-27, that blue bar, the county bar, drops more significantly because that line is set lower. If you look at the table in the bottom, you'll see the result of those changes, which is kind of on average between 26 and 30, we would be able to fund that housing bucket at the 50 million. The city's bucket looks more consistently like revenue is generated for it, and there is additional resources for allocation by HPAC in the out years. In fiscal 2031 through 35, again, a similar situation where the housing bucket is more consistently filled, the city buckets are more consistently filled, and again, there are additional resources available for allocation. I think one of the takeaways here is this is a bigger drop for the counties, but by drawing that line lower, it moves that supportive housing services allocation, base county allocation, more into that space where stability is much more likely, where we could be reasonably certain that we would collect enough revenue to fully fund those critical services virtually every year. Next slide. So again, same scenario. This does a transition over 4 years. So because that drop is bigger, we built a scenario where we step it down and the new model isn't fully implemented until fiscal year 2030. So you'll notice again, if you focus on 25-26 to 26-27, that drop is a lot less significant. And it steps down and then starts stepping back up after that point.
And I assume you looked at a longer transition time because it was a bigger drop.
Yes, exactly. And then if you look at the table at the bottom, we see the impact of that. There is, we in fewer years on average, are we filling that housing bucket up to 50 million? The city's bucket in some years never gets fully filled. And then additional resources, in some years there's no money available for that. And again, the out years are the same because again, this transition period is fully implemented before we get to fiscal 2031. And again, the primary question here is, if one of our overriding goals is about providing stability for the counties, what's the level at which to draw that line to try to make sure that we have a reasonable expectation that we're able to provide that level of certainty? Because then what you're doing is you're shifting the volatility from with the counties, which is where it is today. I think that's a really important recognition that right now, because the counties receive virtually all the revenue, they experience all of the volatility. This would shift the impact of that volatility to these other buckets, to that additional resources, to the cities, to the affordable housing. Because again, we cannot reduce the volatility, we're just trying to manage it. So do we want to take questions on that or kind of see some of the impacts?
Let's see how it impacts the counties and then come back to the questions.
President Peterson?
Yeah.
Just a quick note that the title on this chart says 3-year transition, but I believe that it's the 4-year.
This is the 4-year.
This is the 4-year.
It says 4-year, but then in the chart, the title right here.
Oh.
Just for you and for our audience, it is.
Yeah.
It is 4.
We'll get that updated.
All right, next slide. So this table has a lot of numbers on it. What we did, if we can move the little
Those numbers,
chat
but
box.
You have to guess what they are.
So we have annual reports from the counties for the most recent fiscal year 24. We don't get the data we get from the counties does not break out ongoing services and one-time expenditures. We get some detail around their programmatic expenditures and capital investments. So what we did is we took their program expenditures and excluded that built infrastructure. So what they spent in fiscal year 2024, and then adjusted it for inflation to fiscal year 27 figures, if we assume 3% growth. And then we can compare that to the allocations the counties would receive in those 4 different scenarios. The main takeaway here is they are relatively close in terms of, but you can see some of those differences. Scenario 2, the counties, particularly Multnomah County, would receive less than they spent in fiscal year 2024 adjusted dollars. A couple really important notes.
Every scenario.
In every scenario. I think, one thing to remember, number one, that with the counties receiving all of the money except for the admin, collection, and regional investment costs, there's not a way to do this where the counties receive the same amount of revenue that they get today. We also know that in those fiscal year 24 numbers, that some of the counties were spending one-time money on programs that you might define as, or there certainly might be a community expectation that they are ongoing. So we don't have data from the counties to really have a true sense of what are their ongoing kind of current service level obligations to be able to give you a good picture of how this would compare. Because it is possible that based on what they're spending on those ongoing services, those numbers might be closer to what these scenarios would generate. We just don't have that level of detail.
Thank you. And then you did one for fiscal year 31.
Yes, next slide.
After the extension, if it would pass.
Yeah, so we took the transitions.
Next slide, could I get a quick clarification question or further information on the previous slide? Could you provide this information on a per capita basis for counties? And given that our objective is serving homeless people, on a per count in their official pit,
Yes.
please? Okay.
I will just say the county allocations are based on the distribution percentages that are in the Metro Code.
I get that. But I would like to know how that's playing out with total population, but also with population declared as needing services. Thanks. And I personally would prefer to see that kind of information on any chart that looks like this.
Next slide, please. Oh,
So sorry, back on the slide that you were on before, just so I'm super clear. This slide is showing us essentially the purple bars in each of the former slides.
The blue bars.
The blue bars, sorry. And what we're assuming in these scenarios is that the additional like housing and city allocations would exist, they're just not reflected in this? Or is it like Washington County is getting 98 million, but a percentage of that is going to affordable housing and then to the cities in Washington County?
This chart didn't attempt to reallocate any of those additional buckets.
Okay.
Because again, I think part of the structure that Council President has laid out is that those would be subject to HPAC
Okay.
review. And this is more of a comparison of kind of what's the baseline, trying to get a sense of what could they fund from their kind of current service level in that future year based
To-
on those allocations.
To get at the issue about what is the percentage cut that each county would see.
Yeah, question on that. I've heard it said, proposed that the county said, well, we're going to get a 39% reduction, and I don't see any 39% in there. So is that based upon some other scenario that they've run on their own?
Councilor Rosenthal, and similar question from Councilor Gonzalez, I don't know. We have, the counties have done some of their own analysis, and I haven't seen it or reviewed it, so I don't want to kind of take a position on its accuracy.
All right, fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think just even looking at these numbers, I mean, we're assuming the economy will continue to grow, which is why there's inherent growth. And therefore there will be more money to share among the different buckets. Again, these are basic assumptions that I'm making. I think one of the arguments that are being made as well, and I want to figure out too, is like, although the expenditures and allocations are consistent, the cost of delivering the service increases as well. So I think, anyway, just trying to figure out that we'll be good over time.
So-
But let's keep going. Yeah.
Do you have another slide? Okay, so,
Or just the last slide that I didn't really mention, if I can just be
yeah,
incredibly brief. This is the same chart, just pushed out to fiscal year 32, when the tax rate reductions are fully implemented, and compares similarly those 24 numbers adjusted out to 2032 compared to the two scenarios.
Okay.
with none of the transitions.
Because the transitions are fully implemented at that point.
Okay. Right. Duh.
And-
All right,
And without this, scenario 3 would be 0.
that's
Because
right.
Technically, there is
Correct.
none. So
Or scenario 0.
our
Scenario 0 would be 0.
Scenario 0. Yeah, anyway. Yeah, thank
It's a
you.
zero-sum game. So I guess the questions on the table let's just go counselor by counselor and just quick, because we are over now 1 PM. Where are you seeing a line of the guaranteed minimum, or not guaranteed, sorry, not guaranteed, as per what we just heard, but the baseline minimum allocation to the SHS, we have a 250 because that's in 2021, which is where we started the conversation with the voters. We have one that's lower because then that reduces the volatility both to the SHS services, but it also grows the amount of money above the line, right? So where in that are you feeling a line should be looked at and set? The second question is inflation rate. We've assumed a 3%. We've heard from the counties that that's not enough, but we don't know yet from them what they feel would be appropriate. And then there's a transition time between new state, old state, old state to new state. Is it a year? Is it 2 years? Is it 3 years? Is it 4 years? So those are kind of the things that we need to hear from you as we go through these conversations. So, Councilor Wong, we'll just go around the table.
Yes, thank you, Madam President. If I recall from when this measure was brought to voters, it anticipated $1 billion over 10 years. Was that the assumption when we started?
2.5 billion.
Oh,
$2.5 billion.
Okay. But I think just given where we are, I would support the 250 million kind of baseline. Because I think that provides, the least deep cuts to services while also having, funding available for PSH and housing.
And inflation? Any thoughts on inflation? You don't have to have thoughts on inflation, but
No, I have thoughts on inflation.
we all have thoughts on general inflation, yeah.
But I don't think I have anything specific on that.
And then a transition.
Yeah, before year,
You like the 4-year,
I think so.
even with the higher amount of 250.
Right.
Okay, sounds good. Counselor Rosenthal?
I'm sort of atheistic when it comes to 225 or 250, but what originally was thought of was 225 million. So I'm okay with that. That will not be received quite as well. As for the transition, I like the 4-year transition. I think that that's sort of reasonable, and I like the deferral of the tax reduction to 3031.
So no tax reduction?
Well, the 10,
No two-step tax reduction?
no, I didn't mean to imply that. The 0.1% reduction to me is sort of, that just is feel good, look good. It really doesn't accomplish much. It's the reduction to 75.75%. The larger reduction, deferring that until the 3031 period is, I think.
So what's been baked in is a 10% upfront and a 15% later, and you're saying do it 25% later?
Yeah. That's a political issue more than an economic issue. And
Well, it goes to the impact of the counties and the funding too, so, but I hear you. Thank you. All right, Counselor Gonzalez.
Yeah, sweet. I like talking with Counselor Wong about the global numbers around what we expected to raise, and then if we did an extension, how much more over 20 years. But I do want to ask a question just on the original measure in the 10 years. We forecasted back of napkin in 2020 the 2.5 billion over 10 years. Given some of the numbers that you've shared with us, like what are we projected to collect over the first 10 years of the measure? If you had to give me
A range.
More than 2.5 billion.
How confident are you in that?
I'm just kidding.
You got me there, Mr. Kennedy.
Last fiscal year, our actual collections were 335 million. Our new forecast is coming out next week. I think we're probably, safely in the, I probably shouldn't even say that.
Yeah.
You could reasonably expect, 3 billion over 10 years if current trends continue.
Okay. Great, thanks. That's helpful.
they won't, but.
Yeah, who knows? I think too, when we're thinking about economic scenarios in the future, sure, we could have, recessions and dips. We could also have spikes in times of boom, right? So I think it goes both ways in terms of that. And here's hoping to many more booms and good times in Greater Portland. I think the first thing that comes to my mind, and I know Councilor Rosenthal and I, both Washington County Metro councilors, have asked questions because we're receiving information. The first thing that comes to my mind is we need to start talking about what are the real numbers here. And I hope that we can continue to have that conversation, because I'm just concerned about what is being shared and what's accurate and what's not. And so I just have to really put it out there. I don't want to go as far out to say, that it's misinformation or anything, but I think being able to come together to understand as we're having these conversations is going to be super important. Coming back to the question that you asked, President Peterson, to me, scenario one with the 3-year transition feels like the right gradient approach. The 250 million is, I think, a clear commitment to our county partners on the system. And also, I think, would allow for our region to continue to advance the strategies that will help us achieve the original goal and vision of the measure. So, and then to Councilor Nolan's point here, so I'm going to throw a little softball for a home run. as we work through this process, really being able to communicate with the region as we're regionalizing the system. These are the steps we're going to take, and these are the outcomes that you can expect reasonably. So. Thanks.
And on the inflation, any questions on that? I know we've had questions about inflation before.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I mean, I feel like, well, in my conversations with folks, I guess what I'm not, is this just for a forecasting purpose, or when we're actually indexing, why wouldn't we just tie it to like a CPI basket or like West Coast basket rather than some arbitrary number? I guess I'm not clear on that.
We have used a number for forecasting. Many like intergovernmental agreements of this type do tie it to a CPI. The counties will tell you that number is not high enough, that the CPI West doesn't fully capture the extent of the cost increases that they experience. Also say, not to put too much of a fine point on it, the counties would not apply that same methodology to their own general fund allocations. They use inflation rate much like we would use 3%. I think Multnomah County for next year, their general fund, they're making reductions in their general fund, but their program expenses, they're using a 2.7% factor. So every government experiences costs that grow faster than inflation. In these agreements, kind of for the sake of manageability, most people land on using one indicator, though that is often lower than the cost increases that they experience as a regular matter of doing business.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think that makes sense. It sounds like there's different tools that people use for different methods or even funds within their budget, or am I wrong on that?
I mean, reality from a financial management perspective is, generally across the United States, we put revenue limitations on our revenue measures to slow their growth and not on our expenditures. So all governments, just as a matter of practice, have to, constantly evaluate what your operations are and ways to become, more efficient over time to deal with these lines that diverge with your revenues going up or expenses going up and revenues not as fast. That's one of the job of government, is to figure out how do you make that work over time.
Right, for sure. Yeah. And I guess like my whole point about going to the basket was like opening it up to the real indicators in the economy. So for example, if we have like another 22 where we have a very high, single digits inflation, but we're pegged at the 3%. It's kind of a disservice, but again, I trust your numbers and what I think are like best practices in government accounting, but at a high level is like a lot of this money is going to be going either to sticks and bricks, which are very volatile, the materials, as or construction labor or whatever, but most of it too, to rents and to other economic forces that are well beyond 3%. And we can't really calculate that. So that's why I was talking about the CPI basket, but I'll leave it there.
Counselor Nolan? And then I'll round out the conversation and
Thanks.
we'll be done.
I want to flip back to something Counselor Gonzalez said.
I don't think you're on the mic.
Because under current forecasts, is it 30-31 or 31-32 number is 0. And that's the basis we need to be comparing against. So in no case of any of your scenarios, can the counties look forward to getting less than they are otherwise projected to get in that year? I think that's really important for not only our partners at the counties, but the voters who see this work or don't see it. That's really important. Madam President, you also talked about making this a regional program. So in terms of transition, I am much more supportive of a transition from a county siloed business model to a regional model. And I don't see that in any of the scenarios. So that's the transition period. If it takes 2 years, if it takes 4 years, the duration doesn't matter to me so much as where the ending point of that transition is. And it ought to be at a regional program driven by where and how intense the need for services is. And finally, I can't support any scenario that reduces the resources available to the county that bears the largest responsibility for meeting this need, and particularly bears the largest responsibility for meeting the population A need in this program. And all your scenarios showed a reduction in Multnomah County revenues. So even below what I consider to be already an unreasonable distribution number in the measure itself. So on behalf of the constituents that I represent, I can't support a program that says, you have the biggest problem. The numbers say that, but you get the least, no, you don't get the least amount of money, but you would experience a declining amount of number, understanding that they also are projected to get 0 in 31, 32, while the other two counties who have legitimate need. I'm not saying that they don't have important responsibilities, but the extent and the intensity of it is not the same as, frankly, the folks in the district I represent. Those are my constituents, sleeping on the streets in downtown Portland, sleeping in the mud and the gook and the squalor out on Marine Drive. And I can't in good faith say I'm going to support a program that shifts resources away from those people.
Okay, so the specificity of where the line would be drawn, the inflation, you want to get back to us on that?
I think Brian has presented a reasonable, well thought out explanation of a 3%. I suggest, I don't get to manage my household budget based on what I'd like to spend. It has to be managed based on what I'm going to bring in.
And in transition time?
Transition time depends on what we're transitioning to.
Okay.
If we're transitioning to still a county siloed program,
yeah,
I don't care. We ought to
And
transition in 4 years to a regional.
And for the record, I think there's going to be some things that we need to put in the ballot measure for the longevity of this program of consideration of tipping points. One is to more of a regional system. One is when do we deal with the emergency on hand, and then we are in some sort of programmatic state. And what does that also then mean for switching or rethinking how the buckets minimum maximums are discussed in terms of affordable housing? Like, there's a couple tipping points over the next 25 years that we should be baking in that HPAC would review and consider. So I hear you on the regionalization. Just to make sure, as I go through these conversations with all of these folks and take what you have said, I want to make sure that my goals are clear to everybody, that what we're trying to achieve here is more consistent support for the counties, the service providers, and those receiving services to know what to expect year upon year upon year, so that we reduce the anxiety. When we did this measure, put it together in the full 3 weeks that we put it together in last time, roles and responsibilities were not clear and measures of success were not clear. And I want to make sure that we reduce the anxiety on everybody in this program by knowing exactly what we're trying to achieve and who it has the role to achieve it. We want to avoid the upcoming funding cliff in 2031 when the tax expires. So we want an extension, reducing the need and frequency for unexpected cuts, again, reducing anxiety, ensuring many more years of support through the sunset extension, maintaining housing placements that are currently funded. Stability and long-term success for the program has to prioritize stability of services for the people who have exited homelessness to keep them housed in the coming years. We are trying to, at a bigger level, as Councilor Nolan noted, regionalize the system and really think about inflow and outflow. And until we, as a region, have a coordinated discussion about meeting our production and needs goals on the housing side and our needs on the homelessness side to move people out of homelessness, we will not fully succeed. And so I'm looking forward to the next conversation with you all about governance structures and how to knit that together with the expenditure level. So much appreciated. You guys were awesome and very thoughtful as per norm. And Councilor Rosenthal, did you have a question?
I suppose a technical question is do we see as baking into the proposal a reevaluation time? You mentioned a couple strategic time points. It would seem that all these things are going to be on the table at some point because situations may change dramatically, whether it's the 3%, whether it's the 225, whether it's 250, and whether it's even the governance structure itself. Would these be baked into a particular time period or a particular like 3031 for new recommendations to come forward, whether the program needs to continue or whether it should be reevaluated?
What I have heard is a desire to have a relook at the tax rate. And what worries me is the timeline in which we would put that in, because too short a time frame does not stabilize the program. Too long a time frame may miss an opportunity. So I'm not sure yet what to do with that, but we can certainly talk about that next time. Councilor Gonzalez.
Thanks, President Peterson. Yeah, going back to the slides that Brian was showing, earlier we talked a little bit about the administration rate for the region. And so I was looking at the little orange bar at the bottom as well. So I'm hoping that, again, kind of bringing it back to that conversation we were having about determining, even if we have the authority to collect up to the 5, identifying what a reasonable rate is. And I think it would go a long way for Metro to say, 0.5%, 1% is going to this regional, whatever, So as we're asking the funds to shift throughout the region. So just want to put that on record and see how we can continue to work on that.
Yeah, in fact, we created a subcommittee for you to have that conversation and get back to the council. So, yep, in real time, new subcommittee. With that, councilors, is there anything else that you wanted to quick bring up before we end this conversation and move to CLO communication? I just want to thank staff for getting us to this point. There's a lot of work to get the numbers that are not projections, they are not forecasts, they are scenarios, to make sure that we have something to talk through, because it is all relative, right? That's the whole point of having the conversations, that is relative. How will this affect? We can only talk about it in relative terms. We'll have a forecast for a year, but we certainly are not trying to forecast for the next 24 years. On our transportation side as well, nobody is asking us to do that. So I would just like to say thank you for that. And Carrie, you want to turn?
Yeah, just one quick point of clarification, and I'll come back to the administrative costs. They are covered in our code and we can review that with council. I think it's important to clarify just for council and for the public, whether or not the charge of the subcommittee would be to gather information to bring back to council, or whether it be make recommendations. If it's the latter, then it's subject to Oregon Public Meetings Law, and we would be conducting the meetings in that manner. If it's just an information gathering committee for the council's sort of full consideration, then that would not be subject to Oregon Public Meetings Law. I'm not looking at this as I set this up to discuss the value of a public meeting or not a public meeting, but rather just so staff has clarity into how to conduct those meetings.
Counselor,
Yeah.
would you like to gather information?
I only want to gather information for our general knowledge.
And then you'll bring it back.
Yes.
Okay,
and
thank you.
Wherever the council takes it from there, we'll see.
Okay, thank you.
For that clarification. I think that given where we are in the process, that certainly makes sense, and that might be the structure that I would recommend to council for future information gathering topics around this. That way it's brought to the full council in the amount of time that we have to sort of consider
Yep.
this for a future referral. Thank you.
Great. No, thank you. Okay, we will move on. Again, just thank you to staff, all of staff, not just the math staff, all of staff. Thank you. Moving on to COO communications.
Pass.
Okay, thank you. Do I hear a pass from all of you? No. Counselor Communications. All right, with that, we are adjourned and our next meeting is, hold on, sometime in the future. Tuesday, December 3rd, 2024, 10:30 a.m. See y'all there.
I'll be here on Thanksgiving Day for turkey at Walmart.
Oh, you're coming to the special fest?